Professor Dershowitz, thanks so much for joining us here on Newsmax TV.
Thank you.
President Obama's Mideast speech, is this likely to help or hurt the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
It's going to set it back considerably. It hurt the peace process gravely, just as his earlier speech in the beginning of his administration did, when he insisted that Israel impose a freeze on all settlements. That put the Palestinians in an impossible position. They couldn't be less Palestinian than President Obama. So they then insisted that there be a freeze as a condition of negotiations, and negotiations broke down. He made the same mistake again in this speech. He put himself ahead of the Palestinians. That is, he insisted that Israel go back to its 67 borders with land swaps, but he did not demand that the Palestinians give up their right of return. Now, the Palestinians in their negotiations were prepared to give up their right of return in exchange for Israel going back to its 67 borders with land swaps. But now that the president hasn't made that as a demand on the Palestinians, they can't agree to that. And so he's made the peace process and negotiations far more difficult.
Now, the U.S. seems to be ignoring its problem with Iran and instead focusing on this issue. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the 1,000-pound elephant in the room that threatens Israel's security more than the Palestinians or the Syrians or the Egyptians is the prospect that Iran will develop nuclear weapons. And although he threw a little bone against Iranian development of nuclear weapons, he did not guarantee Israel that Iran would not be permitted to develop nuclear weapons. In fact, he had a vague statement saying Israel has to be prepared to defend itself alone, meaning that it could not expect Israeli help from the United States. On balance, it just increased the distrust that most Israelis have in Obama, made him less of a potential facilitator of peace, and I think set back the progress and the process for peace considerably. It would have been far better had he not made that speech than that he included the few paragraphs he did about Israel, which were ill-conceived and I think not helpful to the peace process.
Professor, how do you see this speech impacting relations between the United States and Israel?
I think it's going to have a terrible impact. I think that we'll see polite discourse between Israeli leaders, but the level of distrust has gone up dramatically. I think that Israelis will get their back up against the wall. Palestinians will say, we don't really have to give up anything because the President of the United States didn't ask us to give up the right of return. The only positive thing that came out, of course, was the United States indicated it would probably not go along with the Palestinian ploy of trying to get recognition for statehood from the United Nations, and the United States repeated as usual its concern for Israel's security. But beneath the concern for Israel's security, it set back Israel's security, I think, by allowing the Palestinians to believe they will still have a right of return, which could easily turn Israel into yet another Muslim extremist state. I think also the speech was not particularly good for the United States. It set us out in a way that showed naivete and created a situation where I think neither side will be encouraged to move toward peace by what the president said. So I think on balance, it was a net loss rather than a net gain. And I'm disappointed because I favor the two-state solution. I voted for Obama, and I was hoping that he would have a more sophisticated and realistic approach to negotiations, which he doesn't seem to have. He has twice now set back the prospects for negotiations and a two-state solution.
Do you regret voting for President Obama now?
No. On balance, I prefer him to the alternative, but I keep an open mind, obviously, as to any future election. I do regret that he has not been prepared to sit down with people who voted for him and who stand for Israel's security, and that he's apparently gotten advice from people who haven't given him the best advice on how to move the process forward. I don't think he has been well advised on how to proceed, particularly now with George Mitchell leaving. I think this puts us further away from negotiations and further away from peace than we've ever been. And the tragedy is, during the Obama administration, the prospect of peace has gone further away than it's ever been in recent years, since Israel offered to give the Palestinians a state in 2001 under President Clinton, and then Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians a statehood, two-state solution in 2008. Right now, I think we're further away, and the Obama administration so far has pushed us further away from negotiations than any previous administration in recent memory.
How do Jewish voters in America view President Obama's stance on the Israeli borders, and could this cost him the Jewish vote in 2012?
Certainly, the Jewish vote is very much up for grabs in 2012. I think a lot of Jewish voters, pro-Israel voters, and also Christian pro-Israel voters, are very disappointed in his views toward Israel. And more than his views toward Israel, I think that many of us are disappointed that he has set back the possibility for a negotiated peace by getting ahead of the Palestinians and pressuring them to take positions that are inconsistent with getting back to the negotiating table. So it's not so much that he's not supportive of Israel, is that he doesn't seem to know what to say to get the Palestinians to reasonably make compromises. He knows what to say to try to push the Israelis to make compromises, but he insists on virtually nothing from the Palestinians, and that's going to make it much more difficult to come to the negotiating table and sit down. I wish he had said to the Palestinians, the Israelis are prepared to sit down without any preconditions and negotiate. Why don't you sit down now and negotiate? Well, he can't do that because he's already told the Palestinians previously, essentially, that they should insist on a freeze as a condition to negotiation, something that's politically difficult domestically for the Israelis to carry out. So he's been ham-handed in how he's dealt with the issue of negotiation, and the result is we're further away than ever before from a negotiated peace. And that's, in large part, the fault of President Obama, and I think that's the terrible tragedy of how he's handled this process.
All right, Professor Alan Dershowitz, thanks so much for joining us here on Newsmax TV.
Thank you.